From the tense whispers of the corridors of power in Washington, D.C., to the secretive communications exchanged between Havana and Moscow, the story of the Cuban Missile Crisis unfolds as a drama of fear, strategy, and the very real possibility of annihilation. It was a moment when the world seemed to teeter on the edge of nuclear war, a precarious dance between two superpowers whose decisions would echo across decades. In the autumn of 1962, the globe held its breath, waiting to see whether diplomacy or disaster would prevail. It is in this context that we peer behind the curtain, uncovering the hidden calculations, the unspoken anxieties, and the human decisions that nearly brought the Cold War to its most frightening climax. Hello, and welcome to The Other Side Stories. Here, we travel beyond the usual headlines to explore the untold tales of world history, mysteries, turning points, and hidden connections that shaped our planet. If you love discovering how the past still echoes in our present, you're in the right place. Let's uncover the other side of history together. The roots of the Cuban Missile Crisis stretch back to the Cuban Revolution of 1959. Fidel Castro and his revolutionary forces overthrew the long-standing Batista regime, installing a government that rapidly aligned itself with the Soviet Union. For the United States, this shift was alarming. Just 90 miles from Florida's coast, a communist government in Havana challenged not only America's sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere, but also the perception of the U.S. as a dominant global force during the Cold War. Initially, the American response was a mixture of covert operations, economic pressure, and overt threats. However, as Cuba cemented its alliance with the USSR, the situation intensified into a confrontation that would draw the entire world into its orbit. From the outset, the Kennedy administration faced the dual challenge of projecting strength while avoiding provocation. President John F. Kennedy, who had assumed office in January 1961, inherited an era of heightened tension and mutual suspicion. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961 had already demonstrated the complexities and potential pitfalls of intervention. This ill-fated attempt by U.S.-trained Cuban exiles to overthrow Castro ended in disaster, humiliating the United States and emboldening the Cuban leader. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, watching these developments, began to see an opportunity to both defend his ally and challenge the U.S. strategic advantage. By the summer of 1962, intelligence reports began to hint at the construction of medium- and intermediate-range ballistic missile sites on Cuban soil. For American analysts, this was a moment of shock. The prospect of Soviet nuclear weapons within striking distance of the U.S. mainland upended decades of strategic calculations. A missile stationed in Cuba could reach Washington, New York, and virtually every other major city within minutes. The balance of terror, the fragile equilibrium that had defined the Cold War, was suddenly at risk of being violently tipped. The discovery of these missile installations was, in itself, a testament to the capabilities and courage of U.S. intelligence agencies. Aerial reconnaissance flights over Cuba produced photographic evidence that confirmed the Soviet presence. These images, captured from high above Cuban soil, revealed the construction of missile sites, support infrastructure, and troop deployments. Analysts worked tirelessly to interpret these photographs, assessing both the number and readiness of the missiles. Each day that passed brought new insights and new anxieties about the immediacy of the threat. President Kennedy convened the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, commonly known as EXCOM, to deliberate over the possible responses. The stakes could not have been higher. One misstep could lead to nuclear war. Within this advisory body, voices clashed over the appropriate strategy. Some advocated for a full-scale invasion of Cuba, aiming to neutralize the missile threat decisively. Others proposed surgical airstrikes targeting the missile site specifically. Yet, a third camp warned of the unpredictable consequences of military action, noting that any aggression might provoke retaliation not only from Cuba but from the Soviet Union directly. The decision that emerged was a blockade, or quarantine, of Cuba. By imposing a naval cordon, the United States aimed to prevent further shipments of offensive weapons to the island while avoiding immediate escalation into armed conflict. The word quarantine was deliberately chosen to signal restraint. Blockade carried a legal weight that could be interpreted as an act of war. This subtle choice of terminology underscores the meticulous attention to nuance and the high stakes involved in every facet of decision-making during this tense period. As the quarantine began in mid-October 1962, American forces mobilized with extraordinary speed. Naval ships positioned themselves strategically, and the public was warned that the situation could deteriorate quickly. The world watched as Soviet ships approached the quarantine line, their cargoes unknown, each moment fraught with potential catastrophe. Back-channel communications, letters, and secret meetings became lifelines of diplomacy as both superpowers navigated a path between confrontation and compromise. Throughout these tense days, Kennedy and Khrushchev engaged in a careful exchange of messages. Letters from the Soviet Premier alternated between conciliatory and confrontational tones, reflecting both the desire to avoid war and the determination to uphold Soviet interests in Cuba. Kennedy, for his part, balanced the need to project firmness with the awareness that any misreading of Soviet intentions could precipitate disaster. Advisors on both sides worked tirelessly to assess motives, interpret signals, and anticipate responses, highlighting the intricate interplay between human judgment, perception, and the machinery of war. Public perception was also a critical factor. Kennedy's administration needed to reassure the American people, who were increasingly aware of the proximity of nuclear weapons to their shores. At the same time, the president sought to avoid inflaming international tensions or give the Soviets reason to escalate. Carefully orchestrated speeches, measured press releases, and controlled leaks to the media became tools to manage the narrative and maintain public confidence. The Cuban Missile Crisis, in this sense, was fought not only through military maneuvers and diplomatic cables, but through the careful shaping of perception on a global scale. Behind closed doors, the deliberations were intense and personal. ExComm members debated scenarios of attack and counterattack, considering not only the immediate consequences, but the long-term geopolitical ramifications. Each recommendation carried weighty ethical and strategic implications. The possibility of civilian casualties, the risk of Soviet escalation, and the specter of nuclear annihilation loomed over every discussion. Kennedy's own temperament, marked by pragmatism and measured judgment, proved decisive in steering the deliberations toward a solution that emphasized containment and diplomacy over immediate military action. Meanwhile, in Cuba, Fidel Castro navigated his own complex calculus. While he welcomed Soviet support as a guarantee of the revolution's survival, he was acutely aware of the risks posed by escalating tensions with the United States. The Cuban leader pressed for decisive action, urging Khrushchev to take bold steps to protect the island. Yet, he also recognized that reckless aggression could invite devastating retaliation. Castro's perspective adds a critical dimension to the crisis, illustrating how local actors could influence decisions in a global conflict dominated by superpowers. By October 28, 1962, a resolution emerged through careful negotiation. Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a public American commitment not to invade the island. Additionally, the United States secretly agreed to remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey, a move that would address Soviet security concerns without provoking public outrage in the U.S. This dual agreement allowed both sides to claim a form of victory while avoiding the catastrophic outcome that loomed just days earlier. The aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis reverberated across the globe. For Kennedy, the resolution was a vindication of a strategy that combined firmness with diplomacy, but it also prompted internal critiques about whether the U.S. could have achieved a more favorable outcome. Khrushchev faced both praise for avoiding war and criticism within the Soviet hierarchy for perceived concessions. The crisis underscored the fragility of global peace and the centrality of communication, trust, and careful calculation in international relations. In respect, the Cuban Missile Crisis stands as a defining moment of the Cold War. It illustrates the dangers inherent in nuclear brinkmanship and the critical role of leadership, intelligence, and diplomacy in steering the world away from destruction. Lessons from this episode continue to inform contemporary strategic thinking, reminding policymakers of the delicate balance between deterrence, negotiation, and the human dimensions of decision-making. Yet, beyond the political and military calculations, the Cuban Missile Crisis also tells a story of fear and hope. Fear because the stakes were existential, threatening the very survival of nations and the lives of millions. Hope because through reasoned judgment, courage, and restraint, humanity narrowly avoided catastrophe. It is a story of the power of dialogue, the necessity of understanding an adversary's perspective, and the days following the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis were filled with reflection, analysis, and, in many cases, relief. Across the United States, Americans breathed a collective sigh of relief, though few fully comprehended how close the world had come to nuclear disaster. Within government circles, there was an acute awareness that the delicate balance that had been maintained was not guaranteed to hold in the future. The crisis had exposed vulnerabilities in intelligence, communication channels, and the mechanisms for crisis management, prompting a reassessment of protocols that would shape international diplomacy for decades to come. One of the most lasting impacts of the Cuban Missile Crisis was the recognition of the critical importance of direct communication. The so-called hotline between Washington and Moscow, established in the months following the crisis, allowed for immediate, secure dialogue between the leaders of the two superpowers. This innovation was designed explicitly to prevent misinterpretation and accidental escalation, ensuring that messages of urgency could bypass bureaucratic delays. The hotline would later serve as a vital tool during subsequent confrontations, including the tense moments of the Vietnam War and the later stages of the Cold War. The crisis also forced a reconsideration of nuclear strategy. Prior to October 1962, the prevailing doctrine emphasized the buildup of arsenals and the projection of military might as a deterrent. While deterrence remained a central principle, policymakers began to appreciate the limits of relying solely on threats and military posturing. The human factor, the capacity for misjudgment, miscommunication, and misperception, had proven dangerously consequential. Strategic planners increasingly recognized that diplomacy, back-channel negotiation, and a nuanced understanding of the opponent's psychology were indispensable complements to military capability. On the Soviet side, the Cuban Missile Crisis precipitated internal debates and tensions. Premier Khrushchev faced criticism from elements within the Communist Party who felt that he had compromised Soviet prestige by agreeing to remove the missiles. Yet he was also lauded by others for averting a nuclear confrontation that could have resulted in catastrophic losses. The crisis highlighted the delicate interplay between domestic politics and international strategy. Leaders in both the United States and the Soviet Union had to weigh not only global consequences, but also the reactions of their political constituencies, military advisors, and party hierarchies. Cuba, too, underwent a period of intense reflection. For Fidel Castro, the removal of the missiles was a mixed outcome. On one hand, the Cuban government retained its sovereignty and avoided an American invasion. On the other, the primary guarantee of security against future U.S. intervention, the Soviet nuclear umbrella, had been partially withdrawn. Castro's experience during the crisis reinforced his commitment to cultivating Cuba's resilience and to deepening the country's alignment with the Soviet Union, while simultaneously pursuing strategies that could enhance his nation's autonomy in the face of external threats. The crisis demonstrated the power of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance in modern warfare. The U-2 reconnaissance flights that captured the first images of missile sites over Cuba had provided crucial evidence that guided policy decisions. Analysts pored over the photographs, identifying missile types, launch pads, and troop deployments. Each detail informed XCOM's deliberations, allowing decision-makers to balance risk against potential gain. The Cuban Missile Crisis thus became a case study in the importance of timely, accurate intelligence and the role it plays in averting or precipitating conflict. In the months after the crisis, both superpowers engaged in extensive diplomacy to stabilize their relationship. Treaties were proposed and signed to limit nuclear proliferation, enhance verification mechanisms, and establish clearer rules of engagement. Among the most significant outcome was the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963, which prohibited atmospheric, underwater, and outer space nuclear tests. This treaty marked a turning point, reflecting a growing acknowledgement that while nuclear weapons remained central to national security, their unchecked proliferation and testing posed grave risks to humanity. Public memory of the Cuban Missile Crisis has evolved over the years. Initially, it was framed as a triumph of American leadership and resolve, emphasizing Kennedy's decisive action and measured diplomacy. Historical analysis, however, has painted a more nuanced picture. The crisis was as much a story of luck, chance, and human error as it was of strategy and foresight. Miscalculations on both sides, inadvertent escalations, and the inherent unpredictability of nuclear confrontation all played roles in bringing the world perilously close to disaster. Contemporary scholars have often emphasized that the resolution of the crisis depended on restrained communication and the willingness of leaders to weigh the costs of war against political gains. Cultural representations of the Cuban Missile Crisis further illustrate its enduring significance. Films, documentaries, and novels have explored the tension, fear, and moral dilemmas faced by those at the center of events. These portrayals serve as reminders not only of the political stakes, but also of the human emotions involved: fear, anxiety, hope, and courage. The crisis transcended policy debates and entered the collective consciousness, shaping perceptions of leadership, diplomacy, and the potential consequences of nuclear conflict. Education about the crisis has emphasized lessons that remain relevant in modern times. It teaches the importance of patience, negotiation, and understanding the perspective of adversaries. It underscores the dangers of overconfidence, miscommunication, and unilateral action. In classrooms and seminar rooms, the Cuban Missile Crisis serves as a cautionary tale and a source of insight into the interplay of politics, strategy, and human psychology under extreme pressure. The human dimension of the crisis is particularly compelling. For those living in the shadow of potential nuclear war, the stakes were deeply personal. Families in the United States and Cuba experienced a heightened sense of vulnerability. Governments had to consider the welfare of civilians alongside strategic objectives. The psychological impact of living under the threat of sudden annihilation cannot be overstated. Diaries, letters, and memoirs from the period convey the pervasive anxiety, illustrating that the Cuban Missile Crisis was not merely an abstract geopolitical event, but a lived experience of fear and uncertainty for millions of ordinary people. In the corridors of power, the crisis reshaped leadership styles. Kennedy's deliberative approach, which emphasized listening to advisors, weighing alternatives, and seeking consensus, became a model for crisis management. Khrushchev's willingness to negotiate under extreme pressure highlighted the complex calculations leaders must make when their nation's survival and prestige are at stake. The Cuban Missile Crisis thus offers enduring lessons in leadership, demonstrating that decision-making under extreme duress requires a combination of intelligence, intuition, and moral judgment. The role of secrecy and controlled information was another defining feature of the crisis. Both the United States and the Soviet Union maintained tightly controlled channels of communication. Public statements were carefully crafted to convey strength without provoking unnecessary escalation. Leaks were managed to prevent misinformation, and internal deliberations were shielded from public scrutiny. This delicate balancing act between transparency and secrecy became a template for managing high-stakes conflicts in the nuclear age. The aftermath of the crisis also saw a reevaluation of military doctrine. Leaders on both sides recognized the dangers of over-reliance on rapid response strategies that could lead to unintended escalation. Plans for nuclear war were revised, emphasizing flexibility, verification, and the possibility of de-escalation. Military advisors were increasingly involved in discussions of political strategy, acknowledging that the consequences of action or inaction extended far beyond the battlefield. Internationally, the Cuban Missile Crisis altered perceptions of power and influence. Nations around the world witnessed the confrontation and drew lessons about the limits of superpower reach and the importance of strategic positioning. Non-aligned countries, in particular, observed how global conflicts could impact regional stability. The crisis underscored that even distant nations could find themselves entwined in superpower rivalries, reinforcing the interconnectedness of global politics and the necessity of careful diplomacy. Historians have also highlighted the interplay between ideology and pragmatism during the crisis. While the United States and the Soviet Union were ideologically opposed, both recognized that rigid adherence to principles could be catastrophic. The resolution required a pragmatic assessment of risk, a willingness to compromise, and an appreciation of the shared desire to avoid total destruction. Ideology mattered, but it was tempered by the human imperative to survive, demonstrating that even in the most polarized conflicts, reason and negotiation can prevail. The Cuban Missile Crisis continues to resonate in contemporary strategic thinking. Policy analysts study the episode to understand crisis escalation, signaling, and deterrence. Military planners examine the decision-making processes, the timing of actions, and the coordination of intelligence. Diplomats reflect on the importance of channels for direct communication, trust building, and the management of perceptions. The lessons of October 1962 remain relevant for addressing conflicts that involve nuclear powers, regional rivalries, and the unpredictable consequences of rapid escalation. In the decades following the crisis, the world witnessed a series of arms control agreements, summits, and negotiations that reflected the enduring impact of the events in Cuba. These agreements sought to limit the proliferation of nuclear weapons, establish verification regimes, and provide frameworks for dialogue during moments of tension. The Cuban Missile Crisis served as a catalyst, illustrating the stakes of failure and the potential rewards of careful, disciplined diplomacy. Ultimately, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a convergence of human agency, strategic calculation, and historical contingency. It was a moment when The Cuban Missile Crisis also exposed the profound interdependence of intelligence, technology, and policy in the nuclear age. The U-2 reconnaissance flights over Cuban territory, equipped with state-of-the-art cameras, provided high-resolution images that were indispensable to American decision-makers. Analysts studied each photograph meticulously, cataloging missile types, support structures, and troop movements. Each revelation informed the XCOM decisions, shaping both immediate tactical decisions and broader strategic calculations. The crisis highlighted how technological advancements could both illuminate and complicate the paths of international diplomacy. One of the most remarkable aspects of the crisis was the role of back-channel communications. While formal channels remained constrained by protocol and political considerations, unofficial communications allowed for candid exchanges between leaders and intermediaries. For instance, letters between Kennedy and Khrushchev, exchanged over several days, carried proposals, concessions, and nuanced assessments that may never have been publicly disclosed. These correspondences provided a space for reflection and negotiation, demonstrating the necessity of private dialogue in resolving public crises. The risk of miscalculation loomed throughout the crisis. Both superpowers understood that a single error could trigger a cascade of catastrophic consequences. In Washington, discussions frequently turned to hypothetical scenarios, from airstrikes to full-scale invasion, each weighed against potential Soviet retaliation. In Moscow, leaders debated the credibility of American threats, the likelihood of escalation, and the political implications of either standing firm or compromising. These deliberations underscored the precarious nature of nuclear strategy, in which uncertainty and perception often outweighed material capabilities. Cuban leadership under Fidel Castro faced its own existential dilemmas. While the presence of Soviet missiles offered a measure of security against American invasion, it also placed Cuba at the center of a potentially devastating confrontation. Castro pushed for more aggressive responses at times, reflecting both ideological commitment and the desire to secure his nation's sovereignty. Yet he too recognized the devastating costs of direct conflict. His decisions during the crisis exemplified the complexities faced by smaller powers entangled in superpower rivalries, where agency existed but was constrained by the overwhelming capabilities of larger nations. The crisis demonstrated the importance of psychological insight in leadership. Kennedy's careful consideration of both Soviet intentions and American public opinion influenced his choice of the quarantine over immediate military action. Khrushchev, in turn, weighed the implications of appearing weak against the perils of confrontation. Understanding the adversary's mindset, anticipating reactions, and gauging thresholds for escalation became central to the decision-making process. The Cuban Missile Crisis thus became a study in applied psychology, highlighting how perceptions, beliefs, and fears shape the course of history. International reactions to the crisis varied widely. European allies of the United States closely monitored developments, some expressing relief at the resolution, while others questioned the wisdom of nuclear brinkmanship. Nations in Latin America observed the unfolding events with concern, aware that regional security dynamics could be dramatically altered by the confrontation. Non-aligned nations viewed the crisis as evidence of the perils of superpower rivalry, underscoring the vulnerability of smaller states caught between competing blocs. The Cuban Missile Crisis revealed the global ripple effects of localized tensions and the interconnected interactions that defined Cold War geopolitics. The role of media during the crisis also warrants examination. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and televised reports shaped public perception, influencing both domestic and international opinion. While certain information was withheld for security reasons, the public was acutely aware of the severity of the situation. Media coverage amplified the psychological tension, heightening awareness of the stakes while also contributing to a sense of collective anxiety. The crisis highlighted the interplay between information dissemination, public sentiment, and policymaking, a dynamic that remains relevant in contemporary international crises. Beyond the immediate political and military dimensions, the Cuban Missile Crisis had profound cultural and societal implications. In the United States, the fear of nuclear annihilation influenced art, literature, and popular culture. Films depicted dystopian futures, novels explored existential dilemmas, and public education initiatives emphasized civil defense. The crisis left an indelible mark on the collective consciousness, shaping generational attitudes toward risk, security, and the responsibilities of global citizenship. It served as a stark reminder that geopolitical decisions reverberate far beyond the halls of power, impacting ordinary lives and cultural narratives alike. The Cuban Missile Crisis also illuminated the ethical dimensions of leadership under existential threat. Decisions about the use or restraint of military force involved not only strategic calculation but moral judgment. Kennedy's choice to impose a naval quarantine rather than launch immediate strikes reflected a consideration of human cost alongside national interest. Similarly, Khrushchev's willingness to remove missiles in exchange for American concessions demonstrated a recognition of shared humanity amid ideological conflict. These ethical considerations underscore the profound responsibilities borne by those who wield power in moments of unprecedented danger. In the long term, the crisis catalyzed reforms in crisis management and national security planning. Both superpowers instituted mechanisms to improve communication, coordination, and decision-making under high-stress conditions. Military command structures were reviewed, protocols for escalation were clarified, and procedures for rapid intelligence analysis were refined. The lessons learned informed not only subsequent Cold War confrontations, but broader principles of governance, risk assessment, and interagency collaboration. The personal dimension of the crisis is equally compelling. Leaders, advisors, and analysts operated under extreme pressure, fully aware that misjudgments could have catastrophic consequences. Diaries, memoirs, and oral histories reveal the intense psychological strain experienced by those at the center of decision-making. Fear, uncertainty, and the weight of responsibility shaped both individual behavior and collective outcomes. These human experiences remind us that history is not only the product of abstract forces, but of lived moments, fraught with emotion and moral complexity. Another critical aspect of the crisis was the interplay between strategic deterrence and tactical risk. Both the United States and the Soviet Union had to consider not only immediate threats, but the broader implications of their actions. Deploying nuclear weapons, mobilizing forces, or initiating military strikes carried the risk of unintended escalation. Each step required careful calibration, balancing the demonstration of resolve against the imperative to avoid conflict. The Cuban Missile Crisis thus became a textbook example of deterrence theory in practice, illustrating both its power and its perils. The resolution of the crisis also reinforced the importance of compromise and pragmatism. While both superpowers sought to advance their strategic interests, neither could achieve absolute victory without risking destruction. The negotiated settlement, Soviet withdrawal of missiles in Cuba, and the secret removal of U.S. missiles in Turkey allowed each side to claim a measure of success while avoiding catastrophe. This outcome underscores the potential for diplomacy to succeed even in situations of extreme tension, emphasizing negotiation, mutual understanding, and the recognition of shared stakes as vital tools for conflict resolution. In Cuba, the crisis reshaped domestic policies and priorities. Castro recognized the vulnerabilities exposed by the confrontation, invested in strengthening defensive capabilities, enhancing political cohesion, and cultivating international alliances. The experience reinforced Cuba's perception of its strategic significance while also highlighting the fragility of small states situated near global superpowers. The Cuban Missile Crisis thus exemplifies how international confrontations can profoundly influence domestic political development, national identity, and strategic planning. Academically, the crisis has been the subject of extensive study and debate. Scholars have examined the roles of individual leaders, the influence of bureaucratic structures, and the interplay of chance and choice. The event is frequently cited in discussions of crisis management, negotiation theory, and international relations. It serves as both a cautionary tale and a source of insight, illustrating the conditions under which rational actors can navigate near-catastrophic situations successfully. The Cuban Missile Crisis also had enduring implications for nuclear proliferation policy. The close brush with disaster highlighted the dangers posed by the spread of nuclear weapons, informing future non-proliferation efforts. International treaties, monitoring mechanisms, and verification protocols were developed to reduce the likelihood of similar crises. The events of October 1962 reinforced the urgency of balancing national security with global responsibility, emphasizing that the stakes of nuclear confrontation extend far beyond individual states to encompass the survival of humanity itself. Psychologically, the crisis left a deep imprint on both policymakers and the public. The recognition of how narrowly nuclear war had been avoided created a pervasive awareness of vulnerability and the limits of control. This collective memory influenced attitudes towards subsequent conflicts, arms negotiations, and the broader trajectory of the Cold War. The experience shaped not only policy decisions, but cultural narratives, reflecting the enduring impact of near-catastrophic events on societal consciousness. Ultimately, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a nexus of politics, strategy, human psychology, and international relations. It showcased the high stakes of leadership in the nuclear age and the extraordinary consequences of human decision-making under pressure. It highlighted the necessity of accurate intelligence, the value of diplomacy. The Cuban Missile Crisis also prompted reflection on the role of alliances and international partnerships during moments of acute tension. NATO allies, particularly in Europe, were closely observing the unfolding events, concerned about the implications for continental security. While the United States bore the primary responsibility for managing the crisis, the perspectives and reactions of allied nations influenced strategic calculations. Coordination, reassurance, and diplomatic engagement with partners were essential to maintaining cohesion, projecting credibility, and preventing misinterpretation. At the same time, the United Nations played a subtle but significant role. Secretary-General U Thant intervened by facilitating communications and offering mediation, emphasizing the importance of international institutions in mitigating the risks of conflict. While the superpowers conducted most negotiations bilaterally, the presence of the UN underscored the potential value of neutral, multilateral frameworks for communication and conflict resolution. The crisis thus reinforced the idea that global governance structures, even if limited in power, can contribute to stability during periods of heightened danger. The lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis extended into the realm of military readiness and command structure. Both superpowers recognized the importance of flexible yet disciplined decision-making protocols. In the U.S., procedures were refined to ensure rapid and coordinated action without triggering unintended escalation. The Soviet military also re-examined the processes for deploying strategic forces and coordinating responses to international provocations. These institutional reforms sought to reduce the likelihood of accidental conflict while enhancing the capacity for deliberate, informed decision-making under pressure. Intelligence operations, in particular, underwent substantial reassessment. The effectiveness of U-2 reconnaissance and signals intelligence during the crisis highlighted the value of timely, accurate information. Yet, analysts also recognized the limitations of intelligence, including the potential for misinterpretation and the influence of cognitive biases. These insights led to improvements in analytical methods, cross-checking procedures, and the integration of multiple sources of information. The Cuban Missile Crisis, in this sense, served as a catalyst for innovation in the practice of modern intelligence. The human element remained central to the unfolding drama. Advisors, military officers, and analysts were acutely aware that their recommendations could have life or death consequences for millions. The weight of responsibility shaped deliberations, communication styles, and risk assessment. Diaries, memoirs, and later interviews revealed the profound psychological impact of operating under the shadow of nuclear catastrophe. Fear, moral consideration, and professional judgment intertwined, shaping choices that ultimately determined the course of history. The crisis also illuminated the power of perception and signaling in international relations. Each action, statement, or movement of forces carried multiple layers of meaning. For instance, the American naval quarantine needed to convey firmness without provoking aggression, while Khrushchev's letters sought to signal both resolve and a willingness to compromise. Understanding how actions would be interpreted by an adversary was as critical as the actions themselves. Misreading intentions could have led to catastrophic miscalculation, emphasizing the centrality of communication, perception, and interpretation in global strategy. On the domestic front, the crisis influenced public opinion and political discourse. Americans experienced an unprecedented awareness of global vulnerability, leading to increased engagement with issues of defense, foreign policy, and civil preparedness. Media coverage, public speeches, and educational initiatives contributed to a shared understanding of risk and responsibility. The psychological imprint of the Cuban Missile Crisis endured, shaping attitudes towards subsequent conflicts, arms negotiations, and the role of the United States in global security. In Cuba, the crisis reinforced the interplay between national sovereignty and international alliances. Castro's government recognized both the strategic value of Soviet support and the inherent vulnerabilities of dependence on a superpower patron. Policy adjustments, military planning, and diplomatic outreach reflected a nuanced understanding of Cuba's position in the broader Cold War context. The events of October 1962 thus had long-term implications for Cuban national strategy, shaping internal governance, defense priorities, and foreign relations for years to come. The ethical dimensions of leadership under crisis conditions became a subject of ongoing reflection. Decisions regarding the potential use of nuclear weapons required not only strategic calculation, but moral evaluation. Kennedy's choice to pursue a naval quarantine rather than immediate airstrikes reflected a careful weighing of human costs, national interests, and long-term consequences. Khrushchev's eventual withdrawal of missiles similarly embodied a recognition of shared humanity and the catastrophic potential of miscalculation. These ethical considerations highlight the profound responsibilities inherent in leadership during moments of existential risk. The Cuban Missile Crisis also underscored the importance of contingency planning and scenario analysis. Both superpowers engaged in extensive simulations, wargaming, and predictive modeling to anticipate potential outcomes. These exercises revealed vulnerabilities, clarified the consequences of different courses of action, and informed strategic decision-making. The crisis demonstrated that preparedness, analytical rigor, and structured planning are indispensable tools for managing uncertainty and mitigating the risks of high-stakes confrontation. Internationally, the crisis reshaped the dynamics of Cold War diplomacy. It demonstrated the value of negotiation, compromise, and back-channel communications in managing conflict that could easily escalate to catastrophic levels.
Leaders around the world observed how careful diplomacy, restraint, and the priority of human survival over ideological victory could avert disaster. The Cuban Missile Crisis became a template for balancing power, projecting deterrence, and navigating complex geopolitical landscapes. The cultural impact of the crisis cannot be understated. It influenced art, literature, film, and public discourse, shaping collective understandings of risk, leadership, and the consequences of nuclear weapons. Authors, filmmakers, and commentators grappled with the existential dimensions of living under the threat of instant annihilation. The crisis became a lens through which societies examined fear, responsibility, and the ethical implications of technological advancement. These cultural expressions, in turn, contributed to public understanding and policy debates, reinforcing the interconnectedness of perception, policy, and society. One of the most profound lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis was the demonstration of human agency in shaping historical outcomes. The actions, decisions, and judgments of individuals, Kennedy, Khrushchev, Castro, and their advisors, determined whether the world would face nuclear devastation or return to cautious stability. While structural forces, ideology, and military capabilities framed the context, it was ultimately human choice, deliberation, and restraint that averted catastrophe. This underscores a broader historical truth. In moments of extreme risk, individual decisions can alter the course of global events. The crisis also prompted long-term reflection on the role of secrecy and transparency. Both superpowers maintained controlled information environments, balancing the need for public reassurance with operational security. These constraints shaped domestic and international perceptions, influencing how leaders communicated strategy, intentions, and capabilities. The careful management of information became a critical tool in crisis navigation, demonstrating that effective communication, both public and private, is essential for preventing misunderstanding and escalation. Moreover, the Cuban Missile Crisis highlighted the fragility and resilience of international norms. While nuclear weapons had introduced unprecedented destructive capacity, existing diplomatic channels, treaties, and agreements provided mechanisms for de-escalation. The crisis reinforced the notion that norms, rules, and mutual expectations, though often imperfect, play a critical role in maintaining global stability. The interplay between formal agreements, informal understandings, and individual leadership choices illustrated how international order relies on structure and human judgment. The psychological legacy of the crisis continued to shape policy and perception long after October 1962. Awareness of how narrowly war had been avoided influenced strategic thinking, arms control negotiations, and civil defense initiatives. Leaders internalized the lessons of brinkmanship, recognizing that miscalculation or misperception could yield catastrophic results. Societal attitudes toward nuclear risk, foreign policy, and global engagement were similarly affected, illustrating the enduring impact of high-stakes confrontations on collective consciousness. In retrospect, the Cuban Missile Crisis stands as a defining example of the interplay between power, strategy, ethics, and human decision-making. It demonstrates the necessity of combining military capability with diplomacy, the importance of accurate intelligence, and the value of restraint under pressure. It serves as a reminder that even in the most extreme circumstances, thoughtful leadership, careful negotiation, and ethical consideration can prevent catastrophe and shape the course of history. The crisis also influenced subsequent military doctrine, emphasizing the importance of communication, verification, and proportional response. Both the United States and the Soviet Union refined their command and control structures, reassessed the deployment of nuclear forces. As the world gradually moved beyond the immediate aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, historians, policymakers, and citizens alike reflected on the profound lessons it had imparted. The events of October 1962 were not merely a historical footnote. They were a vivid demonstration of the fragility of peace in the nuclear age, the consequences of strategic misperception, and the remarkable potential of human judgment to avert catastrophe. Scholars would later dissect the crisis in classrooms and academic journals, analyzing the interplay of power, ideology, and personality that had defined this extraordinary moment in history. The crisis also illustrated the limits of conventional wisdom in times of unprecedented danger. Prior to October 1962, many military and political planners assumed that nuclear deterrence alone could maintain stability. The presence of Soviet missiles in Cuba challenged these assumptions, demonstrating that geography, perception, and rapid intelligence could disrupt even the most carefully constructed doctrines. In response, strategic thinking evolved, incorporating lessons about signaling, escalation control, and the critical importance of understanding an adversary's perspective. For the United States, the crisis reinforced the value of careful deliberation under pressure. Kennedy's management of XCOM exemplified a process of collaborative decision-making, balancing multiple viewpoints, assessing risks, and weighing ethical considerations. While debates over airstrikes, invasions, and blockades were often heated, the ultimate decisions reflected a commitment to restraint, negotiation, and the preservation of life. Kennedy's approach has since been cited as a model for crisis leadership, demonstrating that measured, informed decision-making can prevent irreversible consequences even in the most dangerous circumstances. In the Soviet Union, Khrushchev faced a similarly complex calculus. He had to navigate the expectations of the Communist Party, the strategic objectives of the USSR, and the realities of military vulnerability. The decision to withdraw the missiles from Cuba, while controversial within Soviet circles, ultimately prevented direct confrontation and preserved a path toward strategic stability. Khrushchev's actions underscored the centrality of pragmatism, psychological insight, and a willingness to compromise in managing crises that could otherwise spiral into disaster. The Cuban Missile Crisis also transformed the nature of U.S.-Cuba relations. While the immediate threat of nuclear confrontation was diffused, the United States maintained economic sanctions and political isolation measures that would persist for decades. Cuba, for its part, deepened its alliance with the Soviet Union, relying on Moscow for security guarantees while pursuing strategies to maintain national sovereignty. The crisis thus had enduring geopolitical consequences, shaping the contours of the Western Hemisphere and the strategic calculations of both regional and global actors. On a broader level, the crisis exemplified the profound interconnections between local, regional, and global politics. A small Caribbean island became the focal point of a global confrontation, demonstrating that even relatively minor players can influence superpower dynamics under certain conditions. Cuba's role highlighted the ways in which smaller nations navigate, leverage, and at times become entangled in conflicts far beyond their borders, shaping the trajectory of history through strategic positioning and diplomatic engagement. The role of chance and contingency in the Cuban Missile Crisis cannot be overstated. Factors such as the timing of U-2 reconnaissance flights, the interpretation of photographic evidence, and the sequence of communications all contributed to the outcome. At numerous points, minor miscalculations or misperceptions could have triggered escalation. The resolution of the crisis thus reflects not only deliberate strategy, but also the unpredictable interplay of events, underscoring the inherent uncertainty and fragility of global security during periods of extreme tension. Education about the crisis has emphasized both its historical significance and its enduring lessons. Students and scholars examine the Cuban Missile Crisis to understand decision-making under pressure, the consequences of misperception, and the critical importance of communication. The event serves as a case study in negotiation, risk assessment, and ethical leadership, offering insights that extend well beyond Cold War history. By analyzing the crisis, contemporary leaders and citizens can gain a deeper appreciation for the complexities of managing high-stakes situations in a rapidly changing world. Culturally, the crisis left an indelible mark on literature, film, and popular consciousness. Works such as films depicting Cold War tension, novels exploring existential risk, and public speeches addressing the fear of nuclear annihilation all drew inspiration from the events of October 1962. The crisis became a lens through which societies examined human behavior, moral responsibility, and the consequences of technological advancement. By embedding these lessons in cultural memory, the Cuban Missile Crisis influenced public understanding of leadership, risk, and the ethics of power. The ethical dimension of the crisis remains a central focus for reflection. Leaders faced moral choices with the potential to affect millions of lives. The decision to pursue a quarantine rather than immediate military strikes demonstrated that the value of human life and the avoidance of catastrophic consequences must weigh heavily in policy decisions. Similarly, Khrushchev's decision to withdraw missiles highlighted a consideration of the shared responsibility for human survival, even in the context of intense ideological rivalry. These choices offer enduring lessons in the moral dimensions of governance and strategy. In subsequent decades, the Cuban Missile Crisis informed arms control initiatives and diplomatic frameworks. Treaties such as the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, and subsequent agreements on missile reduction reflect the recognition that unchecked proliferation and mismanagement of nuclear capabilities pose existential risks. The crisis served as both warning and guide, illustrating the need for mechanisms that reduce uncertainty, foster dialogue, and provide verification to prevent inadvertent conflict. The crisis also underscored the importance of integrating multiple forms of intelligence and analysis. Signals intelligence, photographic reconnaissance, human intelligence, and open-source observation all contributed to the understanding of Soviet capabilities in Cuba. Analysts were required to synthesize complex, sometimes contradictory data to provide actionable insights. The interplay of different intelligence disciplines demonstrated the necessity of comprehensive, coordinated approaches to risk assessment and decision-making in high-stakes contexts. On the human level, the Cuban Missile Crisis emphasized the psychological burden of leadership. Leaders, advisors, and analysts faced immense pressure, fully aware that their decisions could trigger global catastrophe. The stress of operating under such conditions shaped thought processes, influenced judgment, and underscored the importance of clear-headed deliberation, empathy, and moral responsibility. Personal narratives from the period reveal the profound weight of these decisions and the lasting impact on those who vote for the crisis. Strategically, the crisis reinforced the value of signaling and credibility. The United States needed to demonstrate the seriousness of its intentions while avoiding actions that could provoke escalation. The Soviet Union, in turn, needed to signal resolve without risking catastrophic retaliation. Understanding how each side would perceive actions and statements was essential to prevent miscalculation. The Cuban Missile Crisis became a model for the study of signaling theory, demonstrating the delicate balance between threat, restraint, and negotiation in international relations. Ultimately, the Cuban Missile Crisis serves as a reminder of both human vulnerability and resilience. It illustrates how ordinary and extraordinary individuals operating within complex systems can shape outcomes of immense consequence. The crisis highlights the interplay of chance, judgment, and ethical consideration, offering enduring lessons for governance, diplomacy, and personal responsibility. The world narrowly avoided nuclear catastrophe, demonstrating the potential for human foresight, restraint, and negotiation to preserve life and stability. The legacy of the Cuban Missile Crisis continues to inform contemporary global affairs. From regional conflicts to nuclear deterrent strategies, policymakers study October 1962 as a case study in crisis management. The principles of communication, restraint, and understanding the adversary's perspective remain central to preventing escalation in situations of high risk. The crisis stands as both a warning and a guide, illustrating the catastrophic potential of miscalculation and the enduring value of strategic prudence. The Cuban Missile Crisis, therefore, is more than a historical event. It is a testament to the power of leadership, the complexity of international relations, and the profound impact of human choice. It serves as a reminder that history is shaped not only by material forces, but by the decisions, courage, and ethical considerations of individuals acting under immense pressure. The crisis challenges us to reflect on our responsibilities, both as citizens and as stewards of a shared global future. In conclusion, the Cuban Missile Crisis exemplifies the convergence of strategy, ethics, psychology, and diplomacy. It demonstrates the potential for disaster inherent in nuclear-age confrontations, while also illustrating the capacity for human ingenuity and restraint to prevent catastrophe. The events of October 1962 offer enduring lessons for leaders, policymakers, scholars, and citizens, emphasizing the importance of communication, foresight, and ethical judgment in guiding the course of history. The crisis remains a vivid reminder that the survival and well-being of humanity often hinge on the decisions made in moments of extreme uncertainty. Thanks for watching The Other Side Stories. If you enjoyed this journey through history's hidden paths, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with fellow explorers. Your support helps us bring more forgotten stories to light. Until next time, keep wondering about the past that shapes our future.